In the winter of 1944, deep inside German headquarters scattered across the collapsing Third Reich, there was a quiet confidence that still lingered among many officers. The maps showed neat defensive lines. The reports spoke of weather delays, supply shortages, and exhausted Allied troops. On paper, the war still looked manageable. Germany had been pushed back, yes, but not yet broken, not yet humiliated beyond repair, and certainly not yet outrun. Then the reports about George S. Patton began to arrive. At first, they didn't sound alarming. Just another American general pushing forward aggressively, as Americans often did. German intelligence officers had seen this before in North Africa, in Sicily, in Normandy. Bold advances followed by pauses. Rapid movement followed by logistical strain. The Americans, they believed, were powerful but predictable, strong but slow to adapt once plans were set. This belief had become comfortable. Dangerous, but comfortable. Patton shattered it. The first problem for the German command was not that Patton was advancing. It was how he was advancing. His Third Army was not moving in clean, cautious steps. It was flowing, like water finding cracks in stone. Units appeared where German planners insisted they could not possibly be yet. Towns marked as secure fell before orders to reinforce them were even written. Supply routes that were supposed to hold for weeks were cut in days. German situation maps began to look wrong. Officers would gather around tables late at night, cigarette smoke hanging heavy in the air, staring at red and blue markers that no longer matched reality. Couriers arrived breathless, soaked from rain or snow, delivering reports that contradicted the previous report delivered just hours earlier. One unit would claim the Americans were 10 kilometers away. Another would report tanks already in the rear. This was not normal warfare. Patton's name began to circulate not as a general, but as a problem. In staff rooms across occupied Europe, German officers began asking the same question in hushed voices. How is he moving so fast? Fuel shortages were supposed to slow the Americans. Destroyed bridges were supposed to bottleneck them. Winter weather was supposed to freeze them in place. And yet, Patton's army kept coming, bending rules of logistics that German doctrine considered sacred. 4 German planners trained in rigid operational schedules. This was deeply unsettling. Patton did not wait for perfection. He moved first and solved problems later. German intelligence intercepted messages showing American units improvising fuel supplies, rerouting convoys, even stealing enemy fuel to keep moving. To German eyes, this was chaos. But it was chaos with direction, and direction with terrifying momentum. As early as late summer and fall of 1944, German field commanders began submitting increasingly desperate requests to higher command. They asked for reinforcements that did not exist. They asked for permission to withdraw that was rarely granted. They warned of American spearheads advancing faster than expected, bypassing strong points instead of smashing into them as doctrine predicted. The response from Berlin was slow and often dismissive. Adolf Hitler, isolated and increasingly detached from frontline realities, refused to believe that an American general could so thoroughly disrupt German planning. Reports that described Patton's advance as unpredictable or abnormally fast were often reinterpreted as exaggerations or excuses for failure. The problem, Hitler believed, was not the enemy's brilliance, but his own commander's weakness. This only made things worse, because while orders from Berlin demanded holding ground at all costs, Patton was already thinking several moves ahead. He was not interested in the ground German commanders were ordered to die for. He was interested in what lay beyond it. Roads, bridges, crossings, momentum. German soldiers at the front began to sense it before the officers fully admitted it. There was a feeling that the Americans were everywhere at once. Patrols reported tanks appearing suddenly from unexpected directions. Villages believed to be behind the lines were suddenly full of American jeeps. Communications broke down not because of bombing alone, but because command structures were being outpaced. Fear crept in quietly. It did not arrive as panic at first. It arrived as confusion, as unanswered questions, as officers realizing that the enemy was not playing by the expected rhythm of war. German doctrine prized order, timing, synchronization. Patton seemed to value speed above all else, even if it meant risking chaos. And that terrified them. Captured German documents later revealed something striking. Officers did not simply describe Patton as aggressive. They described him as reckless, unstable, and dangerous, not because he made mistakes, but because he accepted risks they themselves would never take. To German commanders trained to fear logistical collapse above all else, Patton's willingness to outrun his supply lines felt suicidal. And yet, it worked. By the time German command began to adjust their assessments, it was already too late to stop the psychological damage. Patton had earned a reputation inside the German ranks as a general who would not stop, who could not be predicted, who could not be delayed by conventional obstacles. His name alone began appearing in intercepted conversations, often accompanied by urgency and concern. Patton is coming became less a report and more a warning. What unsettled the Germans most was not Patton's tanks or artillery. It was the realization that he understood them. He knew how they thought. He knew where they expected him to be. And he deliberately refused to be there. Again and again, he forced German commanders to react instead of plan, to retreat instead of maneuver. In war, that loss of initiative is deadly. By late 1944, the German command structure was already cracking under pressure from multiple fronts. But Patton's advance added something new to the strain: speed, relentlessness. Since that time itself had turned against them. Every delay, every argument with Berlin, every moment spent waiting for approval, allowed Patton to move further into their rear. The Germans were not just losing territory, they were losing control. And as winter approached, with the Ardennes looming and one last desperate gamble being planned, many German officers privately feared that even their boldest counterstroke might not be enough to stop an enemy who refused to slow down. They had prepared for a powerful enemy. They had not prepared for one that moved like this. Patton was not just advancing. He was changing the tempo of the war. And inside German headquarters, the realization began to sink in. This was not how wars were supposed to move. This was not how the Americans were supposed to fight. And if they could not slow Patton soon, nothing else might matter. By December of 1944, the war on the Western Front had entered a phase the German High Command never expected to survive. Supplies were thin, air superiority was lost, and morale had been battered by months of retreat. Yet even then, there was one final belief holding parts of the German command together. Winter would slow the Allies. Snow, ice, and mud had saved Germany before. It would do so again. At least, that was the hope. Patton destroyed that hope. When the German Ardennes offensive began, it was meant to be a shock. A sudden, violent strike designed to split Allied forces and force negotiations. For a brief moment, confusion spread through Allied lines. German commanders felt something they had not felt in months: momentum. But that feeling did not last long, because as the Germans pushed forward, Patton was already turning. What terrified German officers was not that Patton responded. It was how quickly he did it. Within days, reports filtered into German headquarters that the American Third Army had changed direction entirely, not slowed, not reorganized over weeks. Turned. Entire divisions pivoted, redeployed, and began moving north through brutal winter conditions at a pace German staff officers described as logistically impossible. Roads were frozen, fuel was scarce, snow buried vehicles. And yet, Patton's columns advanced anyway. German map rooms became places of quiet disbelief. Officers stared at pins that no longer represented reality. Front lines drawn in pencil were erased and redrawn again and again, sometimes multiple times a day. A town believed to be secure at dawn was reported lost by afternoon. A road marked impassable was suddenly being used by American armor. The war had become fluid in a way German doctrine struggled to handle. One German officer later described the sensation as fighting a shadow that moved faster than thought. Communications began to fail, not because radios were destroyed, but because information arrived too late to be useful. Orders issued in the morning were obsolete by evening. Requests for reinforcements reached units that had already been bypassed. Some German commanders began making decisions on their own, not out of boldness, but out of desperation. Others froze, waiting for guidance that never came. Patton exploited this hesitation mercilessly. He did not pause to eliminate every pocket of resistance. He left German units isolated, cut off, and surrounded by confusion rather than steel. This was psychologically devastating. German soldiers were trained to fear encirclement above all else. To be cut off meant annihilation. As Patton's forces surged forward, German troops increasingly felt that threat closing in from every direction. Fear spread faster than bullets. Inside German command circles, Patton's name took on a new tone. It was no longer spoken with irritation, but with alarm. Intelligence summaries began mentioning him specifically, noting his tendency to ignore traditional pauses, to attack when logic suggested regrouping, to move when others would wait. One captured report described Patton as a commander who does not respect exhaustion, neither his own nor his enemies. That assessment was accurate and frightening. As the battle around Bastogne intensified, German commanders expected American relief efforts to take time. The roads were choked. The weather was terrible. The situation was perfect for delay. Instead, Patton arrived like a hammer. His advance toward Bastogne was so rapid that German planners had to rewrite timelines entirely. What was expected in weeks happened in days. Some German officers reportedly refused to believe early reports of Patton's proximity. They assumed the information was wrong, or exaggerated, or impossible. Then American artillery began to fall. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. German forces had planned operations based on assumptions of time, how long it would take the enemy to move, reorganize, and strike. Patton erased those assumptions. He compressed time itself. Decisions that should have taken days now had to be made in hours. And many German commanders were not equipped for that pace. This led to mistakes. Serious ones. Units were ordered to hold positions that no longer mattered. Counterattacks were launched against empty ground. Entire battalions moved toward objectives that had already been lost. And all the while, Patton's army kept pushing, ignoring the confusion it created behind enemy lines. Morale suffered deeply. German soldiers began to speak of Patton not as a man, but as a force, something that followed them relentlessly. Prisoners later recalled the sense that once Patton's troops appeared in an area, escape felt impossible. Even retreat seemed dangerous, because American units might already be waiting on the roads behind them. This sense of inevitability broke something inside the German ranks. Officers who had once spoken confidently now sounded uncertain. Their orders became cautious, defensive, reactive. The initiative, the most precious element in warfare, had shifted entirely. Patton was no longer responding to German moves. The Germans were reacting to his. Inside Berlin, frustration turned into rage. Hitler demanded explanations. He accused commanders of incompetence and betrayal. He issued orders that ignored reality, insisting on holding territory that had already been lost. The gap between frontline reality and high command fantasy widened dangerously. And in that gap, Patton advanced. German intelligence struggled to keep up. They misjudged the size of Patton's forces, the directions of his attacks, and his intentions. This was partly because Patton deliberately cultivated an image of unpredictability. He wanted the enemy guessing, and they were. By early 1945, the German command structure in the West was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. Patton's speed had forced them into constant crisis mode. There was no rest, no recovery, no time to think, only react. And reaction, without initiative, is a losing strategy. One German officer later admitted that Patton's greatest weapon was not his tanks or his guns, but his refusal to slow down. Every mile he advanced without pause was another mile stolen from German planning, another hour denied to German decision-making, another thread pulled from an already unraveling command system. As Patton's forces crossed rivers the Germans hoped would delay them, the realization became unavoidable. This was no longer a war of positions. It was a war of movement, and Germany was losing it. The map stopped making sense. Lines meant nothing. Plans expired faster than they could be written. And through it all, Patton kept pushing, driven by an almost obsessive belief that momentum must never be surrendered. The Germans felt that obsession pressing against them like a closing vice. They were not just being defeated. They were being outpaced. And in war, being slower than your enemy is often worse than being weaker. By the time German commanders began to fully grasp the depth of the problem, they were already trapped inside it. Patton had forced them into a state of permanent reaction, where every choice was bad and every delay was fatal. The psychological war was over. They had lost it. By the opening months of 1945, something inside the German war machine had quietly broken. It was not marked by a single defeat or a dramatic surrender. There was no clear moment when officers gathered and admitted the war was lost. Instead, the collapse revealed itself in smaller, more human ways, in hesitation, in exhaustion, in the growing sense that no decision could change the outcome anymore. Patton's army was a major reason for that feeling. German commanders had retreated before. Retreat was not new. But this retreat felt different. There was no space to reorganize, no pause to build a new line, no sense of regaining control. Every attempt to fall back was followed almost immediately by the sound of American engines, artillery, and boots on frozen ground. It felt as if Patton's forces were breathing down their necks. Even retreat was too slow. Inside German units, discipline began to fray, not because soldiers refused to fight, but because the logic of fighting was disappearing. Positions that were defended one day were abandoned the next. Orders changed mid-march. Officers struggled to explain objectives that no longer seemed achievable. The war had become a constant movement backward, faster and faster, with no clear destination. German field reports from this period show a striking change in tone. Earlier documents were confident, technical, precise. Now they were emotional, frustrated, sometimes even resigned. Words like untenable, unsustainable, and impossible appeared more frequently. The enemy was no longer described in abstract terms. Patton was mentioned by name. This personalization mattered. It meant German officers no longer saw the Americans as a faceless force. They saw a commander driving the pace of events, forcing choices, denying rest. Patton became a symbol of everything that was going wrong, a reminder that the enemy dictated the tempo, and Germany was being dragged along behind it. As Patton's forces crossed into Germany itself, the psychological impact intensified. This was not just a military defeat anymore. It was a violation of space that many Germans believed would never be touched. The homeland was supposed to be defended more fiercely, more effectively. Yet Patton arrived there with the same speed and aggression he had shown elsewhere. For German soldiers, this was devastating. Many had been told that once the fighting reached German soil, resistance would harden, morale would rise, and the enemy would slow. Instead, Patton pushed forward without hesitation. Towns fell quickly. Bridges were seized before demolition teams could act. Defensive preparations were overrun before they were completed. The sense of inevitability returned. Captured German soldiers increasingly spoke of surrender not as shame, but as relief. They described exhaustion so deep it felt physical. They described fear, not just of American firepower, but of being caught in motion, overrun while retreating, trapped between orders and reality. Some German officers tried to rally their men by invoking duty, homeland, and sacrifice. But those words rang hollow when Patton's columns appeared on the horizon sooner than expected. Every time, inside German headquarters, the breakdown became more visible. Staff officers worked around the clock, fueled by caffeine and desperation. Yet their work seemed meaningless. Plans were written knowing they would likely never be executed. Commanders issued orders with little confidence they could be carried out. One German officer later admitted that Patton's speed made leadership feel irrelevant. Because leadership requires time to assess, to decide, to adjust. Patton denied them that time. He forced German commanders into constant reaction, stripping away the illusion of control. And without control, authority weakens. By March 1945, it was clear that the Western German armies were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive, to avoid encirclement, to delay capture, to protect civilians where possible. Patton's relentless movement left little room for anything else. The Rhine, long imagined as a final barrier, offered only brief hope. German commanders believed it might slow the Americans. By time, allow for reorganization. Patton shattered that hope as well. Once crossings were secured, resistance collapsed rapidly. The symbolism of that moment was not lost on the Germans. If the Rhine could not stop him, nothing could. German morale crumbled further as news spread of Patton's continued advance, of cities falling with minimal resistance, of units surrendering en masse. The idea of a negotiated peace faded. The idea of holding out collapsed. What remained was endurance, how long individuals could keep going. For many, The answer was, not much longer. By April, surrender became a calculated decision rather than a desperate one. German officers weighed the risks of continued resistance against the reality of Patton's approach. Many chose survival. They had seen what happened to units that hesitated. They knew how quickly Patton closed gaps. When German forces surrendered to Patton's army, the atmosphere was often tense but orderly. Patton, for all his fierce reputation, was known for respecting professionalism in defeated enemies. This, too, affected German decision-making. Surrendering to Patton was often seen as preferable to being destroyed by his momentum. In the end, Patton's greatest victory over the German command was not tactical or territorial. It was psychological. He convinced them that time was no longer on their side. That hesitation was fatal. That every delay only worsened their position. He forced them to confront a reality they could not escape. The war was moving faster than they could endure. After the war, German officers reflected on this with surprising honesty. Many acknowledged that Patton's speed broke their ability to think clearly. That is relentless. Advance denied them the pauses necessary to regroup, emotionally and intellectually. That exhaustion, not defeat, was what finally ended their resistance. Patton did not simply defeat German armies. He outran them. He denied them rest, certainty, and control. He turned movement into a weapon, speed into pressure, momentum into inevitability. And as German command collapsed under that weight, the outcome became unavoidable. The war in the West did not end with one final battle. It ended with a realization. They could no longer keep up. And when a war reaches that point, the end is already written.